Good afternoon, everybody. I'm indeed delighted to be a part of this webinar on cardiac patient for non-cardiac surgery. In the next 20 minutes, I'll be dealing with an algorithmic approach for a patient with cardiac disease coming for non-cardiac surgery. I'll just give a couple of, actually 5 case scenarios, which would make us think, what should we do? What can I do? Patient coming for elective cholecystectomy in a patient with ischemic heart disease, patient with obstructed inguinal hernia in a patient with chest pain, patient with lung carcinoma for bronchoscopy and thoracotomy in a patient who has a drug-eluting stent placed 3 months ago, patient who needs a prostatectomy after having undergone coronary artery bypass grafting 2 years ago, or a patient with descending thoracic aortic aneurysm with ischemic heart disease, decreased left ventricular ejection fraction, and chronic kidney disease. So when we deal with such patients, we need to know, why should we worry about cardiac disease? And what is the pathophysiology of ischemic heart disease? How do we define myocardial injury in non-cardiac surgery and acute myocardial infarction? What should be our approach to a patient with cardiac disease coming for non-cardiac surgery? How do you risk stratify these patients? What should we monitor in these patients? How do you manage perioperative MI if it occurs in the theater or post-operatively? And what are the strategies for the cases highlighted in the first slide? And ultimately, I will end with the announcement of the International IACTA TE webinar, and I request you to join that. Coming to the first part, why do we worry about cardiac disease? This job has been, this fact has been highlighted by Dr. Suhaini very well. 1 in every 3 or 4 patients above the age of 45 years will have cardiovascular disease in the coming future. So cardiovascular disease is a leading cause of death in both developed and developing nations of the world. It's a true global epidemic. And this picture shows the statistics from the National Commission for Macroeconomics and Health in India. And on the vertical axis, we have the number of coronary heart disease cases mentioned in 100,000s. And we have on the horizontal axis, the year 2000, 2005, 2010, and 2015. And as you see, the coronary heart disease incidence has grown up in the last 2 decades. And what is more worrying is that in the age group between 20 to 30, that is the bottom white column, this population is also growing, which means that even if a patient is young, he might be suffering from coronary heart disease, which implicates that the chest pain in an younger individual should not be ignored, and it should be investigated for the possible associated ischemic heart disease or coronary heart disease. Coming to a couple of physiological principles, we should know that the heart is supplied by blood during diastolic phase. This is the systole, this is the diastole, and the blood flow to the coronaries occurs as a result of coronary perfusion pressure, which is the difference between the aortic diastolic pressure and the left ventricular end-diastolic pressure. And the second point we need to remember is, what are the factors which influence the myocardial oxygen supply and demand? The myocardial oxygen supply is determined by the oxygen arterial content, which in turn depends upon the hemoglobin concentration, the saturation of arterial blood, and the position of oxygen dissociation curve, and how good is the coronary artery blood flow in terms of coronary perfusion pressure and the absence of coronary artery disease. On the demand side, we need to control the preload, afterload, contractility, and the heart rate. These are the factors which determine the myocardial oxygen supply demand. This is a physiological principle. Coming to the definition of myocardial injury and myocardial infarction. Myocardial injury is just defined as elevated cardiac troponin values with at least one value above 99th percentile of the upper reference limit. And this myocardial injury is expected to occur in about 8% of patients above the age of 45 when they are undergoing major non-cardiac surgery. And this is a determinant of the outcome in terms of mortality and morbidity. Coming to the definition of acute myocardial infarction, acute myocardial infarction is defined as a condition where there is clinical evidence of rise or fall in cardiac troponin values with at least one value above 99th percentile of the upper reference limit when it is associated with one of the following clinical conditions, that is the patient complain of chest pain, or there are new ECG changes in terms of ST segment elevation or depression, or development of new pathological Q waves, or you have demonstrated regional wall motion abnormality by imaging techniques such as echocardiography, or you have demonstrated a coronary thrombus by angiography or at autopsy. So there are 5 different types of myocardial infarction which have been described. We will be dealing with type 1 and type 2 because this is what we are interested. Type 1 infarction is a infarction which occurs in a patient who has a stable coronary artery disease, but this patient has been exposed to abnormal stresses during the surgical procedure or preoperatively or perioperatively, which leads to the plaque rupture and accumulation of platelets, acute obstruction to the coronary artery, leading to acute myocardial infarction. This is the typical myocardial infarction. The second type of myocardial infarction is the one where there may not be any coronary artery disease, but just because of the heart rate has gone up or the blood pressure has gone down during the anesthetic management or surgical management, there is a acute imbalance in the oxygen supply demand, which predisposes the myocardium to myocardial infarction. If it is not treated promptly, it will lead to myocardial necrosis. So the myocardial injury after non-cardiac surgery is an elevation of postoperative troponin, which has an ischemic origin without other criteria of perioperative myocardial infarction, and this is prognostically relevant. Now coming to the, how do you approach these patients who have cardiac disease undergoing non-cardiac surgery? This is described in this 7-step approach to the perioperative cardiac risk assessment in patients undergoing non-cardiac surgery. This has been published in American College of Cardiology and AHA guidelines in 2014, and this probably is one of the best approaches which we can count upon. And this I have expanded into 2 different slides just for clarity. In the step 1, we need to determine, this was actually pointed out by Dato, Dr. Suhaini as well. First step, we need to know whether the surgery is emergent or it is elective. If it is emergent, the patients need to go to the theater straight away, and no further cardiac evaluation may be possible. And the patient, as he's undergoing the surgical procedure, the anesthesia has to be tailor-made to the requirement of the patient, which includes appropriate monitoring and estimation of blood levels of troponin and other parameters which need to be looked into. Here, we don't have time to prepare the patient for surgery because the patient needs to undergo surgery straight away because the surgery is limb-saving or life-saving. If it is not emergent, that is elective surgery, if it's elective surgery, we need to go to the step 2, where we need to see whether the patient has any active cardiac conditions. If the patient has any active cardiac conditions, patient needs to be evaluated, patient needs to be referred to the cardiology department, and further management is to be done so that you optimize the patient's condition before the patient is actually subjected to the non-cardiac surgery. If there are no active condition, we need to look into the estimation of perioperative risk and also look at the risk of major adverse cardiac events. which I will delineate in the next couple of slides. There are two major risk scoring systems available with us. I will delineate that in the next couple of slides. And if the patient comes under low risk category in the step 4, patient can undergo the non-cardiac surgery without any further evaluation. But if the patient has elevated risk, we need to look into the problem little more carefully. If the patient is having elevated risk, that is the risk of more than 1% mortality based on the risk scoring, which I will be dealing in the next two slides, in which case we need to look into the functional capacity. If the functional capacity is excellent, which means that the METs, that is metabolic equivalents, are greater than 10, or good, that means the metabolic equivalents are greater than, between 7 to 10, or poor, we have to determine if the METs are more than 4, no further testing is necessary for the sake of giving anesthesia and proceeding with the surgery. But the metabolic equivalents are less than 4, or the metabolic equivalents cannot be determined. For example, patient is having immobility because of certain pathological conditions such as knee disease or hip disease, in which case we need to go to the step 4, and we need to subject the patient to pharmacological stress testing. And if the tests demonstrate significant abnormality, we need to study the patient little more extensively, especially in terms of coronary angiography or any other suitable investigation. But if these tests of pharmacological nature reveal normality, patient can undergo surgery straight away. Coming to the risk scoring, the two common methods are, one is the revised cardiac risk index, which includes 6 predictors: history of ischemic heart disease, history of congestive heart failure, history of cerebrovascular disease, history of diabetes needing preoperative insulin, history of kidney disease with creatinine more than 2 milligrams per deciliter, or the surgical predictor is the suprainguinal vascular, intraperitoneal, or intrathoracic surgery. If you add up all the risks depending upon the presence or absence, and if the predictors are 0, the expected risk of death or the major adverse cardiac events is 0.4. If there are one predictor, it is 0.9%. If there are two predictors, it is 6.6%. If there are more than 3 predictors, it is 11%. And also you can classify the surgical risk into low risk category or high risk category. If it is 0 to 1 predictor, it is low risk. If it is 2 predictors or more than 2 predictors, it is high risk. And please note that the recent guidelines have removed that intermediate risk category, because the management of intermediate and high elevated risk or high risk is similar. So we need to look into either it's a low risk case, low risk procedure, or high risk procedure. This is the National Surgical Quality Improvement Program, which is a calculator which is based on data derived from more than 1 million surgeries, provides more comprehensive assessment of surgical risk. But it's a little more complex, and it is web-based, and this can be used, being used in North American continent. And this paper highlights that when we assess the functional capacity, it is better to use the Duke Activity Status Index questionnaire, which is a little more accurate as compared to just going by the subjective assessment of the functional capacity by interviewing the patient. This is the Duke Activity Status Index. And the another index which has been highlighted in the recent, I mean, not exactly recent, in the last 10 years is the Gupta Myocardial Infarction Cardiac Arrest Index, which is used to estimate the risk of myocardial infarction or cardiac arrest. It includes high-risk patients who have been managed with current medical practices and surgical techniques. It includes 5 parameters. What is the type of surgery? What is the functional status? Is the renal function abnormal? What is the ASA class? and what is the age of the patient. Depending on that, this risk score has been found to have better discriminative ability and predictive accuracy as compared to the least revised cardiac risk index. And the role of biomarker has been highlighted in the Canadian Society, Cardiovascular Society recommendations. And this has been highlighted by Dr. Dato, Dr. Suhaini. So I'll skip on this. And a practical approach has been designed in patients for preoperative risk stratification. If you have a high risk patient with RCRI, that is revised cardiac risk index of greater than 2, we might opt to do the biomarkers. And if the biomarkers are normal, that is cardiac troponin less than 0.014 nanograms per ml or the BNP less than 20 picograms per ml, patient can undergo surgery straight away. But if it is elevated, we need to look into the ventricular function by using echocardiography and cardiology consultation and the medical therapy optimization, and probably delay the operation until the troponin levels have come down to the normal. In the 2019 Journal of Cardiothoracic Vascular Anesthesia, we have suggested few modifications of the approach to non-cardiac surgery in cardiac patients, because cardiovascular disease is very rampant in Southern Asian countries, and bedside echocardiographic examination using handheld or portable ultrasound device is available in most of the major cardiac centers. And the idea is that we get baseline information and it may be useful in medical legal purposes. So what we have suggested is that in the step 1, we have suggested that before the emergency surgery is done in a patient with cardiac disease undergoing non-cardiac surgery needs emergency surgery, we should consider bedside ECG, chest X-ray, and echocardiography, which can be done fairly quickly. We do not need a detailed echocardiography report, but the valvular function, the ventricular function, and probably pulmonary artery pressure estimation in a quick manner, which can be done within 5 to 10 minutes with transthoracic echocardiography, and then subjecting the patient to the emergency surgery may be advocated, because we have the baseline information, and then we can titrate the anesthetic management as per the needs of a given particular patient. And we also suggested that when we are progressing to step 2, the ECG, X-ray, and detailed echocardiography and review of drug history may be included. And in these progression from step 5 to step 6, we have suggested that include biomarkers to decide whether pharmacological or stress testing is needed. And the fourth suggestion we have made is that instead of pharmacological stress testing, we may use a coronary angiograph using CT scan. That is, the CT coronary angiogram can be done to determine if the patient has significant coronary artery disease. And if needed, then you can subject the patient to the traditional coronary angiography. These are the modifications we have recommended. This is we are looking forward to your comments on this. And coming to advanced monitoring, we may use a Swan-Ganz catheter or the transesophageal echocardiography in high-risk patients undergoing major surgical procedures which are of non-cardiac in nature. So what we have done is we have developed an algorithm for the choice of hemodynamic monitoring depending on what is the risk based on the revised cardiac risk index, what is the functional status, what is the left ventricular function, and as I said, the risk, is it a low risk or elevated risk? Depending upon the ventricular function and the risk and the monitoring device can be tailor-made to a particular disease, surgical procedure using this algorithm. And for example, if the patient is ejection fraction is 40 to 50, and the patient is undergoing elevated risk surgery, we have advocated use of direct arterial pressure, central venous pressure, along with a non-invasive cardiac output monitor such as flow track. But if the patient's ejection fraction is less than 30%, this should read 30%, less than 30%, undergoing elevated risk surgery, we have suggested advanced cardiovascular monitoring in the form of pulmonary artery catheter and echocardiography. Coming to the anesthetic considerations, use of volatile anesthetic agent or total intravenous anesthesia is reasonable for patients undergoing non-cardiac surgery. Neuroaxial anesthesia for postoperative pain relief may be effective to reduce perioperative MI in patients undergoing abdominal aortic surgery or thoracic surgery. Prophylactic intravenous nitroglycerin is not effective in reducing myocardial ischemia, but we need to monitor the patients carefully, and at the first sign of myocardial ischemia, we need to intervene and start intravenous nitroglycerin. Intraoperative monitoring techniques, the perioperative TE may be resorted to if there's a hemodynamic instability, which is not responding very quickly to the usual maneuvers. Maintenance of normotherapy is advocated. Hemodynamic assist device may be considered if the patient has acute severe cardiac dysfunction. Perioperative use of pulmonary artery catheters may be considered depending upon the underlying medical condition. Coming to the cases we have highlighted, patients who need, this is a flow chart to look into the approach. Patient with ischemic heart disease needs elective cholecystectomy. We need to look into this is elective surgery. So we have skipped the first patient probably has stable ischemic heart disease. First two steps of the approach are skipped, and we determine the risk. And if this becomes high risk because of the intracavitary surgery, patient needs open cholecystectomy and intracavitary surgery with ischemic heart disease. That means the RCRI is greater than 2. And we look at the functional status. If the functional status is less than 4, we need to do the stress test. And if there's significant coronary artery disease in terms of critical triple vessel disease or left main disease, we might have to consider cardiac surgery before subjecting this patient to non-cardiac surgery. Coming to the second case scenario, this is emergency. So it is in the first step and it is life-saving, and we need to subject the patient to the non-cardiac surgery. And because patient is having ongoing chest pain, we might also consider whether we can do a off-pump coronary artery bypass grafting in the same sitting. If you are in a good cardiac center, we might have to consider this, or you have to probably, if you are in a smaller center, you might have to refer this case to a center where there is a facility for cardiac support, both in terms of cardiology and cardiac surgery. The third case scenario, the lung carcinoma with drug-eluting stent. Drug-eluting stent has been placed within 3 months, and the patient has to undergo surgery because we cannot wait any longer. The recommended duration of antiplatelet therapy, mandatory therapy, is 180 days, but this is a sort of semi-emergency. So we need to have a multidisciplinary approach involving the cardiology, anesthesia, intensive care surgeons viewpoint, and the patient preference all have to be undertaken. And the options mentioned here are we need to because we need to take the patient without any further delay in terms of within a few days we need to do the surgical procedure. We need to, the options available here is the bridge therapy with pyrophebban or cangrelor, or you estimate the percentage of inhibition, or you take the patient with platelets available. And the point I would like to make here is that the platelet transfusion before surgery prophylactically is not indicated. And if the patient bleeds on table, then we could resort to platelet transfusion, which means that we need to have platelets available when we are taking such patients. Coming to the fourth case scenario, patient undergone CABG 2 years back, prostatectomy is a stable patient, and meds are more than 4, so the regional technique comes in handy here as long as you have taken care of the antiplatelet medications. And the last case scenario is patient with descending thoracic aortic aneurysm with ischemic heart disease, reduced ejection fraction, chronic disease, kidney disease. Patient should preferably go for endovascular stenting rather than a open procedure. Coming to the last bit of my presentation is what do you do if the patient has a perioperative myocardial infarction in the operating room or just after the cardiac surgery? Just after the non-cardiac surgery. Patient has undergone major non-cardiac surgery and patient landed with a perioperative myocardial infarction. This can happen and there's a lot of confusion what to do. So this is a ready-made diagram to think about quickly what to do in such a situation. The treatment should be individualized depending upon the patient's age, comorbidity, and the life expectancy. If the patient is more than 75 years and a lot of comorbidities and life expectancies within 6 months, we need not have to be very aggressive. We also have to consider, is the patient stable or unstable? And what is the nature of myocardial infarction? And also whether the patient has a high risk of bleeding. So the risk of bleeding can be determined by looking at the Crusade and Gray score, the Crusade score, which categorizes the patients into low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk of bleeding. Depending on that, we need to make a decision whether you are going to do the conservative medical management or a high invasive early invasive strategy in terms of percutaneous coronary intervention. So the cardiologist must be involved at this stage, and we determine whether the ST segment elevation MI and the bleeding risk. If it is ST elevation MI, possibly we should go in favor of the invasive strategy. If it is non-ST segment elevation MI, we should consider conservative management. The conclusions are here. The cardiovascular disease is rampant, as pointed out by Dr. Suhaini, and I will also reiterate that factor. We are going to see every third or fourth patient coming for non-cardiac surgery with cardiovascular disease, and this number is likely to increase in the coming years. Management of cardiac patients undergoing non-cardiac surgery requires in-depth understanding of the cardiovascular pathophysiology and interaction of the surgical and preoperative risk factors. What is the functional status of the patient? That is a crucial factor that determines the need for extensive perioperative workup from cardiological point of view. And we need to understand that the patient may not be having ischemic heart disease in terms of coronary stenosis, but may still have acute myocardial infarction if there is extremes of tachycardia or hypotension during surgical management under our care. Whether it is induced by anesthesiologist or surgeon, that's a different matter. But if the patient has a precarious condition, the patient may develop acute myocardial infarction despite the fact that patient does not suffer from coronary artery disease. This I would like to reiterate. Perioperative optimization of myocardial oxygen demand supply balance is absolutely imperative, and we should have a strategy to diagnose and manage perioperative myocardial infarction in case the patient develops a perioperative myocardial infarction. Before I conclude, I would like to announce and request you to join for this meeting coming up next weekend. This is the 15th National 6th International Teaching Virtual Workshop from CEE. Dates are 20th, 21st, 22nd August. There are about 100 experts from across the globe will be interacting. And there are interesting features like golden plate countries where young researchers will be presenting their papers. And these are the links for you to register. With this announcement, I would like to end my talk, and I would like to thank you for your patient hearing. And we are looking forward to looking at the chat box to answer any questions. I
Thank you.
hand
Thank
over
you.
the podium to Dr. Dato Suhaini to moderate the question answer session.
Yeah. Okay, Dato. Yes, you may proceed with the Q&A sessions. We have a question here that when we stratify risk of MACE for patients, the type of surgery, for example, major op, intermediate op versus minor op, from how I understand, major op is more than 5% death. So his patient RCRI is 1, but going for major op is more than 1% of MACE, or do we solely use RCRI to estimate the MACE?
I think this question is directed to me. Can you repeat the question? I didn't quite
Sorry.
follow the question.
Okay. When we
Sorry about
stratify
that.
the patients for MACE, the type of surgery, for example, major op, intermediate op versus minor op, from how I understand, major op is more than 5% mortality.
Yes,
So,
yes, yes.
yeah, if the
You're right.
patient is RCRI is 1, but going for major op, if this is a more than 1% MACE, or do we solely use the RCRI to estimate the MACE? Thank you.
If the risk is 0 to 1, it is considered low risk. And if it is 2 or more, it is considered as elevated risk. And any procedure above the inguinal ligament, which is vascular in nature, or it is intracavitary, it means the intra-abdominal, intrathoracic, cardiac, or even intracranial. If it is intracardiac, that qualifies to be a risk predictor, and that will get 1 point. That would be my response. If it is only 1 point, it will be still, if the patient does not have ischemic heart disease, does not have diabetes, no cerebrovascular accident, no diabetes mellitus, no history of congestive heart failure, that patient will be considered as low risk from cardiovascular point. He does not have cardiac disease. Basically, there's no history of cardiovascular disease, no history of congestive heart failure, no cerebrovascular disease, no renal disease, no diabetes, but undergoing suprainguinal cavitary surgery, that will be classified as low risk. And we don't need any further investigation for that. As far as the approach which has been delineated in 2014 guidelines, which is followed worldwide.
Okay. Any add-on from Dato? Any opinion?
Not from my side. I'm okay with the answer provided by Dr. Kanchi.
Thank you.
Well said.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions that we've been posed earlier. Sorry that we run over time a little bit. Just maybe we pick up one or two questions. Yeah. For the audience, if you have any burning question, you may raise your hand and speak out. While waiting for that, Dato and Prof, I would like to ask a question: is what is the opinion on the role of spinal anesthesia in patient with IHT with EF of less than 30%?
Is this question directed to me?
Maybe Dr. Kanchi can answer that question. Yes.
Yeah, you can add your viewpoint just after mine. Role of spinal anesthesia in patient with ischemic heart disease, ejection fraction less than 30%. Depends upon what is the nature of surgery. Is it lower limb surgery or is it prostatic surgery? In which case, we could institute spinal anesthesia with monitoring. I would recommend that the intra-arterial blood pressure and central venous access is obtained, and the spinal anesthesia can be provided for lower limb surgery and pelvic surgery. That will be my answer. But the patient should be under full monitor conditions, and the patient is optimized for the surgical procedure. And Dato, you want to say something for this?
Yeah, for regional anesthesia, I mean, the issue of regional anesthesia is actually reduced SVR. So we have dilated peripheral vessels because of the spinal or regional anesthesia. And therefore, the blood pressure might be compromised. So
Sure.
it depends on the technique of regional that you are implementing. If you can gradually reduce the SVR under a proper control without affecting the sudden drop in the blood pressure. Okay, the drop in blood pressure here is basically to maintain diastolic perfusion to the coronary. That is the aim. So if you have a starting blood pressure of 200 systole and 90 diastole, you deliver your original pressure drop to 150 to 85, that is okay for me, no issue. But if you start with a blood pressure of 200 over 95, you start your original, the BP drops to 100 over 45, that might cause an issue because you compromise the diastolic perfusion of the left ventricle. You need to address the sudden drop in the SVR. Okay, how do you address that? Sometimes the vasoconstrictor that we use overshoot. When you deliver the vasoconstrictor and the blood pressure overshoot, you cause unnecessary sudden increase in the SVR afterload and stressing the heart further. So it's all about technique. There's no right and wrong answer here. It's how you address each particular problem delicately and understanding the underlying condition of your patient. So if this is a less than 30% ejection fraction, but the coronary are good, okay, it's maybe because of the dilated cardiomyopathy, and patient is going for hernia surgery, for example, and you can deliver the original in a gradual manner without affecting much of the blood pressure, go ahead. There's no major issue of that. But if the patient is ejection fraction of less than 30%, left main stem is significantly compromised, block, 95% block, for example, or more than 95% block. Okay, and this is clearly an ischemic cardiomyopathy. LV dimension is big, 7.5 centimeter. Patient is going to go for some vascular surgery, and you want to implement regional, be careful. You might need extra hemodynamic monitoring to carefully manage the hemodynamic condition, because the left main stem there might then lead you to a perioperative myocardial infarction.
Yes.
So there's no straight right and wrong answer, but it depends on the patient's situation and it depends on how you deliver your anesthesia technique.
Absolutely.
I hope
Yes. I agree with that. And when I mentioned spinal, it is a patient is sitting and you give the spinal. Patient is not in the lateral position when you give the spinal. Patient is sitting, and you give the lowest possible dose for that particular patient so that there is no spread causing sympathetic blockade when it goes to the upper segment. So if you avoid that and cause only the lower part of the motor and sensory blockade, that should suffice. For lower limb surgery, I'm talking about lower limb surgery.
Yeah. All right. So one question in the chat. Yes, sorry.
And in patients who have regurgitant lesions, decrease in systemic vascular resistance may be therapeutically beneficial. So we have to consider that. And because we don't want to decrease the blood pressure suddenly, epidural is a better choice. The graded epidural may be a better choice.
Okay. So I have a question in the chat saying that what are the opinion on role of medication in pre-op optimization, i.e. beta blocker, ACE inhibitor, dual platelet statins? What is your opinion?
Very nice question. Shall I answer that?
Please, Dr. Kanchi, please.
When you're talking about beta blockers, if the patient is on beta blockers chronically, it must be continued. There is no second doubt about it. If the patient is already on beta blockers, he or she must receive the beta blocker continued till the surgery, including a dose in the morning. But if the patient is not on a beta blocker, but is a high risk category for cardiovascular disease, the beta blocker can be initiated anywhere from 1 to 7 days before surgery. The third point is that the beta blockers cannot be started within 24 hours of surgery. These are the American Society of Anesthesiology recommendations. because we do not know the response of the patient to given beta blocker, and the risk of hypotension cannot be assessed by just starting the beta blocker within 24 hours of surgery. So this is my response to this question.
I am totally agree with you, Dr. Kanchi.
Thank
There
you.
is no supporting evidence to start immediate perioperative period with a beta blocker, ACE inhibitor, alpha-2 agonist that has been elaborated in fairly lengthy in the recent Canadian review on the management of cardiac patient undergoing non-cardiac surgery. In fact, the risk of complication and morbidity is higher if you were to start beta blocker or alpha-2 agonist immediately before the perioperative period.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I have one last question here in view of respect everybody's time. If a patient has a recent CABG, what is the best timing for an elective surgery? How about stroke?
If the
And-
patient has a recent CABG,
Yes.
my answer is that we need to wait at least 6 weeks to be able to see that the endothelium is formed well at the place of anastomosis. And then we also have to consider the anticoagulant status of the patient and then subject the patient to surgery.
Thank you. Dato, any comments on your end?
Yeah, it's always good for us to have a good communication with the cardiothoracic surgeon as well. So we
Yes.
can have direct communication with the surgeons involved, and he might be able to assist us in providing extra information following scheduling a patient immediately after CABG to a non-cardiac surgery. Things like complication that might arise after CABG should be high in the list. Common complication are, for example, what do you call it, cerebral complication, renal complication, or even the list of new medication that is being provided to the patient need to be considered before we decide for a non-cardiac surgery in the immediate post-CABG period. So communication is the keyword.
I agree. I agree. And also when I mentioned 6 weeks, the patient must be absolutely stable in terms of cardiovascular condition. And he has fully recovered from the effects of the surgery. That should be highlighted.
What about stroke, post-stroke? Slightly additions.
Patient had a stroke and he needs to undergo
Yes.
non-cardiac surgery. Very interesting question. The recent guidelines recommend that you need to wait for as much as 6 to 9 months for the cerebral autoregulation to get back to the normal, and the reactivity of the cerebral vasculature for carbon dioxide changes to come back to the normal situation. That is the time recommended, but it also depends upon the gravity of the non-cardiac surgery which you would like to do, whether it's urgent or semi-urgent or it's elective.
All right. Okay.
Would you like to add to this, Dr. Dato Suhaini?
Yeah, totally agree with you, Dr. Kanchi. My approach will be again ABC. What is the etiology of the stroke? Is it thromboembolic? Is it hemorrhagic? We need to understand this. And how bad is the the so-called the cerebrovascular accident? Which area involved, and what does the stroke complicates the overall other end organ of that particular patient, and what are the patient's medication on. All this will have to be played in a considerable manner for us to decide for the subsequent non-cardiac surgery or any other surgery for patient post-stroke.
Thank you very much.
Your formula of ABC is wonderful. We can apply to any condition, looks like.
Yes, indeed. It is very
airway
easy to
breathing
understand.
Circulation.
Yeah.
Just like airway breathing circulation. Very nice.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Kanchi.
Yeah. I think it's very, very enlightening afternoon that we have from Dr. Dr. Suhaini and Professor Kanji. And thank you very much for your excellent sharing. Yeah, I know we are just over time as we kicking off the introductory sessions as of today. I encourage everyone here to sign up for the program to continuous learning from us. And we look forward to chat and learn with you in the coming months. So finally, thank you all for your time joining us in this afternoon sessions. As you look into that, you in the chat box, there are 2 links there where you can click on it, and one is on the feedback. We honored your appreciate your feedback to us, what we do well today and what area for improvement. In addition to that, there's a click box for you to sign up for the program. And in addition, we also will email the recorded webinar to you within next week. Thank you very much, and we look forward to see you again in October. Thank you very much to our panel faculty, Dr. Suhaini and Professor Dr. Kanji. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. See you again sometime.
See you again. Bye.
Thank you so much.